And the Havana Charter is actually not well known to historians either. So people who have never heard of it, perhaps it might not be, it is fairly understandable that it has not been in public discourse. Sometimes failures in history go down and they're kind of brushed to the side. And that's really what happened to the Havana Charter. What the Havana Charter was the creation, the outlines, the discussion that surrounded an international organization that never came into being, called the International Trade Organization. The only thing that was left after the Havana Charter discussions, and this is something that historians will have heard about, was the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT is the abbreviation for that. GATT focused primarily or almost exclusively on lowering tariffs between countries, trying to open, kind of the channels of so-called free trade, but at least increase free trade, the ability for countries to trade between one another. But that was only supposed to be one part of the International Trade Organization, and it was only the tiniest little mention even in the Havana Charter. The Havana Charter itself had a whole realm of other rules and regulations that international trade specialists, economic advisors, but also social welfare experts and those interested in full employment, thinking about viable jobs for not just countries in the industrialized world, but for jobs for people throughout the entire world, were concerned about. And that was raising standards of living, coming up with a very kind of pragmatic, or at least an opportunistic way to be able to maintain high levels of steady employment, sustained and steady employment in individual countries that were involved within this international organization. I mean, of course, there were many difficulties that were involved in that because different countries were on different levels of industrial development, and for some, free trade sounded like an excellent idea. So there were people that were advocating for the ITO to be that kind of free trade organization, more in the sense of what the World Trade Organization is today. But there were also many, especially in the Global South, who were arguing very adamantly that within this idea of trade rules for the post-war world, you needed to have built-in ways for economic readjustments for countries that were struggling during the times they were struggling. So the Havana Charter was a big, difficult document, but it had a lot of different bits and pieces in kind of the world that we know today as far as international trade is concerned, about, kind of opening markets. But it also, in a sense, had the ability for countries to close markets in times that they needed to. So it was called the Havana Charter because it was negotiated in Havana, Cuba, in late 1947 and 48. Another aspect that is really different than what would have happened is the ITO, the International Trade Organization, was slated to become one of the Bretton Woods institutions. So it would have been working with the World Bank. I mean, at the time it wasn't called just the World Bank, but the International Monetary Fund. But it would be tied into these financial institutions and have to do with the trade and employment. So it was really kind of this kind of cornerstone financial organization that was going to serve kind of as the way forward for countries to really grow, employ the people within their countries, but then also trade, to liberalize trade with other countries as well. So it was a big and complicated attempt. So technically, the outlines for the International Trade Organization did come from the United States and the United States State Department. Even before, honestly, right in the middle of the war, right as the United States was joining, the State Department put together kind of a brainstorming organization that was concerned with employment and trade, the two things linked together. So they started their negotiations, their development of kind of a blueprint for what this would look like in 1942. And based on the experience of the United States in trade agreements up to that point, it really was the foundations for what they wanted to do with this grand international organization was to use what were called reciprocal trade agreements. The formula for reciprocal trade agreements that had been negotiated as early as the 1930s during the New Deal. And what the reciprocal trade organizations were intent on doing were bilateral negotiations that could go on between two countries that would lower tariffs. the important part within the United States, which might not be as understandable to other countries as they look in, is that these reciprocal trade agreements were only administered by the executive branch, which meant it was much easier to lower the trade barriers. I mean, it just was, without having the Senate involved in it at all. The issue of tariffs, the issue of trade has always been a very contentious one within the United States. So these reciprocal trade agreements really kind of cordoned off trade into this little special negotiating area of US policy. And that was always the intention as the State Department was moving forward. Let's keep this same formula, this same policy about how we can open the markets, to the world. And it really was about opening trade markets to the world for US goods at that point in time. But the New Deal, the United States in the 1930s had many other attempts that were, trying to overcome economic hardship. And one that emerged really was jobs creation. I mean, a big section of the New Deal had to do with the government spending to create jobs. So full employment also became really a cornerstone to what the United States during the Roosevelt administration was trying to do and what they thought would be good for all countries. So it was really this kind of key tying in that idea of reciprocal trade and lowering tariffs for more access to markets and full employment, and that's why the two were linked together. Perhaps they weren't linked together as constructively as some people wanted during the Havana negotiations, but this is what the United States went into with the intention of kind of having those both aims there. Now, once the idea of the ITO was released to the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, this is in 1946, when the ITO idea really gets rolling as far as international collaboration is concerned. Even then, the State Department was kind of feeling like the project was getting out of control. It was getting out of their hands when all of these countries were starting to make demands, quite honestly. They were trying to hold the U.S. accountable for what this meant within their own economies. And they were also concerned with a lack of attention to industrial development at that point in time, economic development, which they felt the United States kind of left out of this outlines. So in a sense, every step down the line, the idea of the ITO was evolving. It was changing. People were, putting new ideas in it. Some people were pulling their ideas out of it, or at least they were being pulled out. And, during these 3 years of negotiations within the UN itself, they hammered out UN negotiators with the United States kind of in the lead, but Britain as much right in the mix. The outlines for an initial draft for the ITO, and it's known as the Geneva draft because it was drafted in Geneva in 1947. This is what they brought to Havana, Cuba, in November of 1947. Now, instead of 12 or 15 countries that had been negotiating, kind of adding and putting new ideas into this document, there were 60. There were almost 60 countries that were there ready to make demands. Again, much more of a population from the global south than had been invited to any of the earlier UN kind of deliberations. So Havana, November 24th, I believe it was, the conference opens, and suddenly there's just a cacophony of voices that are trying to make, to hold countries accountable. If the desire was higher standings of living, full employment, and opening the channels of world trade, they had to constructively link all of these things together. So that was where they were when they first started the Havana negotiations. Okay, so the Geneva draft ended up being quite to the chagrin of many Americans, and some British too, who really still did see this product as being, opening channels of trade, opening markets, so they could get primary products, commodities from developing countries where you could find, you bring the goods to the industrialized countries so they could use those and produce, manufactured goods. That was, very much an intent of the United States and of Great Britain. So this is, ergo these things about opening the markets for trade, or the channels for trade. But Other countries, who were there, particularly Australia and Mexico. I've looked into the Mexican case more exclusively, but there's a lot in the US archives really about how Australia was saying you have to have some measures for economic development. If we have this intention of higher standards of living, of full employment in different nations, and in, rising standards of living because of free trade, you have to have economic development, or this whole system is really going to collapse before it is even set into place. So, especially Mexico, and I've been down to the Mexican National Archives and looked through the papers of a gentleman, an economic advisor named Ramon Betata Quintana. And Betata was actually, like the Mexicans at the end of the world, very worried that Latin America was going to be left out of this whole discussion, really, that was going to be left to the wayside. The United States, very quickly after the war, started kind of downplaying some of the promises that they had made to them during World War II when they needed allies. They needed people to, really be supporting the Allied war effort, and they needed those raw materials for production, for wartime production. So the U.S. made a lot of kind of really substantive, promises about economic development in the post-war years. So Mexico was aware of this, and in fact, for the last, 3 or 4 years, they'd been coming to international conferences and demanding, that the United States and other nations really, make real these promises that they had been, organizing, or promising. So Mexico basically was the nation that, and Betata in particular was the man who said, we have to have a special commission on employment, economic measures and employment, and we have to have a special commission on economic development. So he proposed this in Havana, and they put together special working groups that were going to work on these topics. And the working groups had more to do than probably they would have even imagined, because there were hundreds and hundreds of amendments that were set forth to this, Geneva draft. And here, again and again, Latin American countries, India, Lebanon, Australia, interjected issues that were of importance to them, issues that had to do with workers' rights, issues that had to do with labor standards and how to protect labor standards in light of economic competition from larger economies that these countries knew was going to happen to them. There were also measures, for ways to deal with safeguards. If these countries were undergoing very, very strenuous economic crises, for instance, safeguards against inflationary and deflationary pressures that the international system might put on individual economies. Within a section that was, kind of redrafted almost in its entirety during 4 months of debates in Havana, there was, the economic and employment activity. This was a chapter that went into the Havana Charter, and there was a section on production, supply, and demand, and opening markets, and that was actually kind of the basis of what they were first trying to do. The United States thought open up markets, and that ergo production would increase and employment would increase. All these things would go down into a chain of activity. But again, many of these countries were saying that might not necessarily be the case. We need to ensure that there are stable rules, to be able to move down that employment is going to happen in the end. So there were, there was a section of that chapter, that was added, a few articles that were about maintaining full employment within domestic economies. And these had to do with putting in place safeguards, again, against the deflationary pressures, but also about trade imbalances. And this, this was a key part. This is something that John Maynard Keynes actually had introduced in the Bretton Woods Conference, that the ITO needed to do, that there needed to be a way to, negotiate these trade imbalances so a country didn't, really get kind of in a hole because of, the strength of the United States. Of course, Mexico noticed that about its neighbor to the north. So these were the ways that, full employment was tied into this whole system. Labor standards, were completely a part of this chapter. And within that chapter, the Mexicans, with the help, actually, the support of people from the International Labor Organization who were there during the negotiations for the ITO, had had pressed for and had inserted into the document of the Havana Charter that the principles of the Declaration of Philadelphia, which is calling for some of these exact same, kind of promises about that they would not let development kind of interfere with the prospects for future kind of economic growth, that this was going to be tied into the package. There were also things in Havana Charter that had to do with foreign investment, that countries could have control over foreign investment coming into their nations, and that they could potentially either compensate property if someone was doing something wrong, that was detrimental to their economy, or they could just simply press the direct investments away. That never ended up coming to being because the ITO did not come to fruition, and honestly left a lot of countries with very vulnerable relationships with foreign investors who were still claiming it was their right to invest in these other countries. So, there are many stopgap measures. There were also quite a few loopholes where countries could get out of free trade agreements, or at least liberalized trade, I should say in that regard, liberalized trade agreements, if they knew they were in a state of crisis. So, those were the ways that they were trying to negotiate around the idea. Yes, the main goal was to liberalize world trade. There's no question. Opening markets was going to be a part and parcel of this system, but it was going to be a system that was negotiable, that countries could come in, and what they would have to do is in the ITO themselves, they would state their case, and they would be reviewed, and then they were given the opportunity, if deemed correct, to put restrictions on certain, certain products or certain exports or certain imports that would either be detrimental to internal development or would be detrimental to their economy in the first place, like, primary commodities. So inserted again in the document, and this is due to the work of Mexico, with the support of many other Latin American countries who, again, were coming to Havana. There were 18 Latin American republics that were there at the time. There were strength in numbers in a certain sense. The Americans were always calling them a bloc, in the middle of these negotiations, because they were always sticking together, which may or may not have been the case, but that's the perception that the United States had about it. But they also, the Mexicans, Batata, also proposed an amendment that said when any case having to do with labor or labor standards comes up to the ITO, negotiations with the ILO will automatically take place, that there is going to be a cooperative agreement between the two, that there will be consultation on both sides, that ITO officials will go to the International Labor Organization to be able to voice their concerns about the system that they're functioning under, and that International Labor Organization officials will go to the International Trade Organization and be able to voice concerns for what they felt. There was a lot of things that crossed over. At that period of time, the International Labor Organization was also trying to negotiate or be in the middle of, or have a say in the way that intergovernmental commodity agreements were being negotiated. Because they knew that had a lot to do with jobs, viable jobs for people in countries. And again, the cost of those commodities in the intergovernmental sense could really mean the difference between, opportunities at home or, just absolutely no opportunities because of the employment dearth that, we talked about, or I talked about earlier. So the ITO and the ILO having those direct, kind of interlinking mechanisms, which I think they could have turned into, would have been very, very beneficial, I believe, for both the International Labor Organization and the International Trade Organization. Now, in the end, the ITO never came into being. The United States in 1950, the US government, the Congress, here's now Congress is involved in these kind of agreements, and there's many protectionists in the United States that were angry about kind of the confines of even the ITO going too far. But if they were not kind of, the ones that were anti-ITO at this time, there was also another group called the perfectionists, if you will, that were saying it doesn't go far enough in guaranteeing free trade. So in a sense, what happened in the United States was the ITO was pinched between the protectionists and the perfectionists. and it was taken off the U.S. roster. Congress just said that they would not even it was not reintroduced, I should say. The president said he would not introduce it to the next congressional session. So in 1950, when the United States said no to the ITO, every other country thought if the U.S. is not involved at this point in time, because the United States really has the strongest international trade economy in 1948, right after the war, many nations of Europe who had been very strong contenders were really having economic difficulties. There's no question about that. So the United States decides not to ratify the Havana Charter, and almost every country afterwards just really felt that the whole project had gone down. Now, what was left actually was the General Agreements on Tariff and Trade, because the General Agreements on Tariff and Trade had been part of the Geneva draft. It had already been set up because it was just this one teeny little section in this larger overarching idea about how to manage international trade. Now, in the General Agreements on Tariff and Trade, it was a system where countries would come together in these trade rounds, I'm sure you've heard of them even from the WTO now, and negotiate tariff readjustments, and generally lowering the tariffs down. But in a sense, the GATT was never what the ITO could have been. The GATT was not really even technically an international organization. If you ever hear people going to these GATT negotiations, they are always called contracting members. They're not, or contracting partners. They are never called members. You're not a member of the GATT, and kind of the membership was never really very robust. But the other thing was it was never part of the United Nations system because it was no. And the links to the the links to the International Labor Organization were really very tenuous then. The ILO was kind of invited to some of these GATT negotiations, but they're always told that this is a kind of closed door session, and there was never as much visibility as to what was going on. And this is another reason that ITO-ILO connection that could have been quite rigorous never came to fruition. And the ILO didn't have, that automatic connection to one thing that they knew was essential for protecting labor standards for workers around the world, and that is international trade. So in a sense, it was the way that this whole system was proposed. I could talk more, but at least I will say just very briefly about how some of these kind of missions, that were the International Labor Organization were really interested in having to do with, such as the commodity agreements, were really in a sense pulled away from its realm of power and put into this other institution, which could have had an institutional connection to it, so it would not have been quite as lacking as it was. But now suddenly the ITO is gone. Everybody denies that there's a reason for it to be around any longer, or it's so contentious that they cannot even, verify it, or rectify it, ratify it. And there's this gaping hole. Meanwhile, only GATT is there. They're only talking about lowering tariffs. They're not talking about balancing employment with economic development, with international trade, with foreign investment, with commodity agreements, this whole realm of things that were supposed to be all packaged together. And quite disappointingly, I think, for the International Labor Organization, that they kind of saw this happening, but it was because of this division of tasks that the United Nations was putting into place. They didn't want an overlap between different institutions. So this is kind of the way that the history unfolded. And I think it's just really, it was a missed opportunity. It was a missed opportunity for the ILO to have this group of this other institution that they could be working with. And it was a missed opportunity to have this direct link with Bretton Woods that had to do with finances. A paper that I wrote kind of for this event, I opened it up with this 50-year celebration in Havana, Cuba in 1997. The World Trade Organization actually had gone to Havana to talk about how and have a celebration on the opening night, the opening night of this Havana conference 50 years ago. first I look at that and I thought, that's just not true. That's not a true indication about how history, went, because the ITO, especially the Havana Charter, was going to be so different from the World Trade Organization that, the comparison is really even just, false. But then perhaps nobody really knew what the Havana Charter was. People just knew that it had to do with international trade, and there was that section about opening the channels of international trade. So, the WTO went ahead and maybe nobody noticed. Now, as we know, kind of anti-globalization, kind of criticism, problems of debt crisis in kind of underdeveloped countries, all of this started to bubble to the surface in, the work of the WTO quite quickly after that. In Geneva the next year, there were big protests on the street, and in Seattle the year after, very, very large, kind of uprisings, you'd have to call them, against the WTO. So, in a sense, it was just saying that these were the exact problems that the ITO was initially set out to, kind of balance, that there wouldn't be these, debt problems, that they also complained in Seattle about human rights abuses for people who were, getting caught in the middle of these markets, and they were losing their property, losing their livelihood because of, kind of the structure of the international trade regime. So I was quite critical about why the WTO would go to Havana and try to claim its history there. But now I think about that a little bit more, and I read a little bit more, and actually I think it was the debate going on in the WTO in the first place about the social clause. And now I would have to say that they're moving forward. They're going in more of a direction of the possibility, the slight possibility that those social clauses can be interjected into some of these trade negotiations. The WTO is not quite there yet, but they are starting conversations again now with the ILO, and there's some very cooperative, very positive measures that are going in place because of those negotiations. Now the problem is, again, even the WTO is not part of the United Nations system, not technically. So there's still kind of this, disconnect. But I wonder if they went to Havana because there were groups within the trade, kind of negotiators that were saying, let's revisit what went on in this place at this time. So on the positive side, I want to think that people are understanding, that there is a reconnect that could be put together. I'm skeptical because, there is something called path dependency in kind of the political science or the social science jargon that says, once you get to a certain level down a path, you might not be able to return to a different track. But I think that so maybe there won't be as comprehensive of an institution as the International Trade Organization, even coming out of the shadows of the WTO. But if there is even a consciousness that, not only are trade and international trade and employment, linked in those, kind of in a very, understandable manner, so a realization or an admission, I guess I should say, but that there can be efforts to move in the direction where they can understand that the two need to be woven together in discussions about international trade. So I'm hopeful that the international community, that the United Nations, even NGOs pressing them to go in this direction, will at some point in time, reconnect the work of the International Labor Organization, the World Trade Organization, and that social clause will become a reality really for people, for the benefit of people that are working in countries that have very have problems really putting people to work. The informal section, if you go to Latin American countries, has just in the last 20 years just exploded, and it is really, I think, as a result of some of this, the way that this was actually negotiated in 1948. And I don't think, I can't really say that everything would have been better 100%, but I think that if there was at least a consciousness of taking care of these things together, then there could have been solutions to some of these problems.